Now let's consider here the introduction discussion when it comes to biodiversity and the concept of systematics. Now, when it comes to the concept of biodiversity and systematics, we're actually going to consider here the concept of taxonomy, which is also known as the arrangement law, or the science of classifying organisms to construct internationally shared classifications. While in the case of systematics, it is now the biology that deals with classification and nomenclature. Now, when it comes to the concept of taxonomy, it is now actually the time in which we're actually relating different types of organisms on how we can actually name them. While in the case of systematics is that right after you name that certain type of organism, where would you put it on a group? So that's the concept when it comes to systematics, okay? We are now creating a system from the name itself. We need to have organized naming and at the same time organized structures when it comes to the presence of the family and of the group in which we are going to place this certain type of organism. So that's the thing about taxonomy and systematics. And now I would like to introduce to you to Carl von Linné, and he is also known as Carolus Linnaeus. And you heard it right, Carl von Linné is his true name and not Carolus Linnaeus. Why is that? So, when it comes to Carl von Linné, he is actually a Swedish botanist, physician, and zoologist. And he is also the father of taxonomy. Carl von Linné actually developed here the idea of binomial nomenclature. Or, basically, it is now by means of providing two names when it comes to the names that would be utilized in different parts of the world. Okay? Carl von Linné started utilizing Carolus Linnaeus after he developed the binomial nomenclature, that he utilized Latin as the language for taxonomy, in which, for instance, Homo sapiens, that is binomial nomenclature, Felis catus for the presence of cats, Chanus chanus when it comes to milkfish, Peperomia pellucida for the presence of pansit-pansitan, and even the presence of Sesamum indicum for the presence of sesame plant. So those are actually some of the names that are actually in binomial. The reason why scientific name is binomial is because of Carl von Linné. And he started with the utilization of the binomial nomenclature starting with his name. From Carl von Linné, he made it Latinized and created Carolus Linnaeus. Okay? So Carolus Linnaeus actually gave us the classification of different organisms based on kingdoms, classes, orders, genera, and species. But nowadays, we're now actually using the more modern hierarchy when it comes to classification, in which we're now actually using the mnemonic, thus King Philip came over for good soup. Or basically, we have the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, or the scientific name. The scientific name would be simply made out of the genus name and the presence of the specific epithet or the species name. So that's the reason why scientific name it is in binomial. Okay? We are utilizing two Latinized words. For instance, a type of lizard that was discovered by Jose Rizal, our national hero, we have Draco rizali. So it is possessing two names. So for instance, the presence of Pterocarpus indicus, for the presence of Nara, the presence of Vitex negundo when it comes to Lagundi. Those are actually some of the examples of the scientific name that is utilizing binomial nomenclature. Nowadays, trinomial nomenclature is also utilized for the subspecies, but everything started, the basics actually started with Carl von Linné. Okay? He actually named the 4,400 animal species and more than 7,700 plant species all throughout his career, all throughout his journey. And he is also appointed as the Chief Royal Physician in 1747 and knighted by the King of Sweden in the year 1758. and all of his observations were written down on his book Systema Naturae, which is the accounts of how he systematized the classifications that are actually present in the modern world. So that's the thing about Carl von Linne. Then, let's now proceed with the concept of phylogeny. Now, in the case of phylogeny, it simply describes the relationships of an organism to which it is thought to evolve from and provide information on the shared ancestry. And this is also commonly known as the tree of life. Okay, so that's the thing about phylogeny. Now, when it comes to the concept of phylogeny, we're actually considering here three major concepts. We have the presence of monophyletic group, we have the presence of paraphyletic group, and lastly, we have the presence of the polyphyletic group. Now, when it comes to the concept of the monophyletic group, it is just the presence of most common ancestors that are actually present only on one branch. While in the case of paraphyletic, it is now the presence of a group of different types of organisms, but they somewhat do not share almost the same ancestry. While in the case of polyphyletic group, their ancestry, the origin of their ancestry is very far from the branch. Or, for instance, in the case of the monophyletic group in this particular case, we can consider this junction, this part, as a monophyletic group. Then in the case of the paraphyletic group, it is now the presence of this portion. Then in the case of the polyphyletic group, it is now the presence of this portion and another portion. And that their common ancestor is long to be traced on the tree of life. And speaking of which, phylogenetic tree could be observed like this. We have the presence of the common ancestors and the different organisms, just like the tree. Or, the most complicated part, if we're going to consider evolutionary biology, it is now the presence of our common ancestor in the center, and we have here the presence of the branching out of the different organisms. But we are going to have a session that would be related with the concept of cladistics and on how you are actually going to utilize here the different concepts that are actually present when it comes to phylogenetic tree and phylogeny. So, in the case of cladistics, it is now an approach to biological classification in which organisms are categorized in groups based on the most common and recent ancestors and the different characteristics that they possess. Unlike in the case of phylogeny that we are simply focusing on the common ancestor, in the case of cladistics, we are now considering here the different characteristics that would be present on the certain type of individual. So for instance, let me give you an example. So these are actually groups of chordates, or these are now the different organisms that are actually possessing backbones. Okay? But even though all of them are possessing backbones, they differ in other characteristics. So for instance, lamprey do not possess any jaw, since the jaws or yung panga would be available on the organisms on the upper portion of the cladistic tree or of the phylogenetic tree, na it would just be available or would be present on sea bass, antelope, bald eagle, and alligator. Okay, so it means that lamprey do not possess any jaws. Then, for instance, in the case of the presence of lungs, sea bass and lamprey do not possess any lungs, but antelope, bald eagle, and alligator, they are possessing lungs. Okay? Then, what could be the other inference that we could get when it comes to a cladistic tree? We can actually say here that the antelope and the alligator share the following common characteristics. Antelope and alligator both possess lungs and they possess jaws. Yun yung characteristics na present sa kanilang dalawa. So that's the thing about the inference that we can actually create when it comes to cladistics. Okay, so for instance, lamprey and antelope do not share the same characteristics except for the presence of the vertebra or the presence of the spinal cord or of the spinal column. Okay, that's the only characteristic that they share. And we could also say that antelope do not possess any gizzard or feathers unlike bald eagle. So those are actually the different inference that we can make when it comes to a phylogenetic tree. And lastly, remember that evolutionary investigations focused on the different types of evidences. It could either be morphologic or genetic. When it comes to the morphologic observations, it is now actually present on cladistics, while in the case of genetic evidences, it is now present on phylogeny. And to simply conclude my discussion, if we are now going to look at the tree of life, specifically when it comes to phylogenetic observations, yes, humans are included as one of the top or one of the prime apes. But if we are now going to consider this, humans are good enough in being humans. Apes are good enough at being apes. Chimpanzees are good enough at being chimpanzees. Because survival of the fittest isn't actually absolute the survival of the fittest, but it will always be the survival of the good enough. And for us humans, we're always constantly changing the environment in which we live into. That's the evolutionary adaptation that we had. And it could be utilized as a positive or a negative trait for us. But at the end of the day, always remember that there is no superior organism. All of us, when it comes to the tree of life, are the prime organisms. Even though we have brains, we do not possess any brains, we do not possess any tissues. These organisms are always on top, all of which are prime organisms. No one is considered as the best because all of us are just good enough.